Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to be talking about how I like to mix piano for pop rock music. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on how I like to use a compressor to change the sound, feel, and tone of the piano so that it sits better in my mix. This could be a couple things depending on my song. Maybe I want the piano to be up front in the mix and really cut through the other instruments and be in the forefront of the music. And I'll show you techniques you can use with the compressor to do that. Or in other situations, you might want the piano to sit back further in the mix, and I'll show you how to do that as well. I'll also talk about EQ techniques if you want your piano to sound a little bit brighter or darker. It's pretty straightforward, and it depends on the style of music and the song you're going for and where you want the piano to fit in with all the other instruments. I'll also talk a little bit how you can EQ the piano so that you'll have space for your vocals to fit in as well. So let's get started. Here's a song that I'm going to be showing you the piano with. I've got pretty much a straightforward setup for pop rock music. Drums, electric guitar rhythms, acoustic guitar, rhythm guitars, then electric lead guitars, bass, and finally over here is the piano that I'm going to be focusing on. For everything else, I've got it pretty much set up, mixed, how I like, levels pretty much balanced, what I'm going for the song. Then the piano right now, I'll play it back and you can hear how the piano sits in with the other parts of the music. There's basically two parts that I'm going to be showing you. There's the intro part where the piano is featured along with some acoustic guitars. And then there's another part where all the other instruments come in. You hear the drums, the electric guitars, and things like that. So I'll play it back and you can listen for those things. So for the most part, the piano's not doing anything too complicated, just blocking chords out, following the chord progression of the song, and then at the beginning the acoustic guitars are following along with that, just mimicking what the piano's doing. So definitely at the beginning the piano is the most important instrument in occupying most of the interest musically of what's going on with the song, so I want it to sound great. Let me go ahead and start showing you how I'm going to process it. I'm going to be focusing right now at the beginning on different techniques you can use with the compressor to change the sound and feel and tone of the piano. I'm going to be using this compressor right here from Waves. It's called the H-Comp I'm going to be using it because I like some of the controls and the features on it. It's very versatile, and for the different techniques I'm going to be showing you, it can accomplish all of them very easily, and hopefully it's very intuitive to you to hear what's going on. The first technique I'm going to be talking about with the compressor is how to achieve a nice sharp attack or fast transient sound that makes the piano sound very punchy and really emphasize the attack or transient of each of the individual notes when they're played. This is a very conventional or typical sound for pop rock music with the piano, where you want the piano to be very punchy and very and be able to cut through the mix. So the technique I'm going to be using has to do with the attack and release controls of the piano. And if you're not really familiar with compressors that much, there's some basic controls. You have a ratio control that you'll see. These are the controls you'll see on almost all compressors. The H-Comp that I'm showing you here has some extra ones I'm not really going to get into. But you have a ratio, and you have attack, release, and threshold. Then you also have a makeup gain up here, the output. It's basically a volume control on the output. These are the things that I'm going to be using. So the thing that the ratio sets is how much compression. A compressor is basically a dynamics kind of processor, or changes the volume of the signal depending on the input of the compressor. So if your signal's loud, then it might be processed differently than if the signal's quieter. And how the compressor determines how it's going to process it is based on the threshold right here. So if the signal goes, the level or the volume of the signal goes above the threshold, that's what the compressor starts to do things like reduce the gain of your signal. But if your input signal is below the threshold, then the compressor won't process it. So you can do some pretty cool things with that by playing around with the ratio and the threshold and attack and release. So the attack and release do different things. They shape how the compressor responds over time. So if you have a fast attack, what that means is as soon as your signal goes above the threshold, the compressor is going to immediately start performing gain reduction. If you have a slower attack, that means that's the amount of time that the compressor is going to delay until it's going to start doing the gain reduction. So again, fast attack, as soon as your signal goes above the threshold, it's going to do gain reduction. Slower attack, this is the amount of time that your compressor will wait after the signal goes above your threshold to start doing gain reduction. So what I'm going to use this attack for is to allow the transient or the initial hit of the notes to go unprocessed through my compressor, but then after they go through, squash the sustain of the notes to emphasize that initial transient. So I'm going to start out with a fast attack. I'm going to set my ratio here on something maybe about 6. This is maybe a little bit over exaggerated, but hopefully it'll allow you to hear what's going on. Then I'm going to play around with the threshold and the attack controls. And what I'm going to try and do is sweep back the attack so you have an opportunity to hear how the compressor responds to the input signals and how it delays, by using the attack control, how it delays the gain reduction that's being performed. You can listen how you can use it to shape how much of the transient goes unprocessed and really control how much you want to emphasize that initial hit of the piano. So right now it's pumping a little bit more than I would want for my mix, but this is hopefully emphasizing it for you to be able to hear. Bypassed. This is going to squash the transients. So in bypass mode, you're not really emphasizing the transients or the attack. So here's probably a closer setting to what I'd actually use. About 4:1 ratio, threshold. So I'm getting about 3 to 6 dB of gain reduction. So that's basically how you can use the attack control to allow some of the initial impact of your piano to go through and allow the piano to cut through a little bit more because the transient is emphasized. Next, let me talk about what you can do using a fast attack and release, and then playing around with the release control to kind of compress just the transient of your signal and allow the tail to pass through. What that's going to do is, rather than have your piano cut through your mix with a sharp attack, by compressing the attack, what it's actually going to do is sit further back in the mix. So this time I'm going to use a fast attack, and again play around with the threshold, and then start out with a fast release and then back that off to find the amount of time that basically squashes enough of the transient so that it kind of dulls or mutes or just changes the tone or the sound of the piano a little bit so that it's not as sharp or cutting through the mix. If your release is too long, then basically what's going to happen is the whole note is going to get compressed, but you really just want that initial part to be processed. Well, what can happen if it's too fast, then you can have some artifacts or different things like that come in for the piano. Bypassed. So now I'll play it back with the other instruments and show you these different settings, and then hopefully it'll give you an idea about how this changes how the piano is going to sit in the mix. This is without even getting into any equalization or anything like that. So right now I've got it processed so that it's going to be pulled back in the mix and sit behind the acoustic guitars. So right now, hopefully you're able to hear that the acoustic guitars are out front in the mix, but the piano's sitting back. I can go back to that original setting that I had where I had a slower attack, and I was emphasizing more of the actual transient of the piano, and you can hear how then the piano is going to cut through better from the acoustic guitars. So those are two techniques that I like to use with the piano, depending on what I'm going for, whether I want the piano to be out front in the mix or if I want it to sit further back in the mix. And basically what I'm doing is using a compressor to only compress one part of the signal. Either I'm compressing the sustain of the signal and letting the transient pass through, or what I'm trying to do is just process the transient of the signal and let the sustain of the notes pass through uncompressed. So that's just different ways of using the compressor if you want to affect one or the other part of the signal. Here's another thing I like to do though. This is a third compressor technique that I like to use when my piano just in general has a large dynamic range. But you can use this for almost any other instrument. This could be vocals, drums, guitars, bass, anything pretty much. And it's a little bit different in the sense that rather than using the compressor to affect one part of the signal, either the transient or the sustain, I'm going to use the compressor basically to just shrink the entire dynamic range of my signal. And how I'm going to do that is use a really low ratio. And that's why I'm using the H comp, is because the ratio control is variable. You can go all the way down to 1-to-1 ratio, which is essentially no compression. You can go all the way up to 50-to-1 ratio, almost basically like limiting. And you can set it anywhere in between. Some other compressors that you use, you might just have control of a couple different ratios, like selecting 4-to-1, 8-to-1, 16, different things like that. But they're fixed ratios. Here, what I'm going to go for is look for just like a very small amount above 1.0. So this could be somewhere like 1.1, 1.2. Then what I want to do with this is use a really low threshold. So basically, the entire signal is going to get compressed, but just by a small amount. Whereas before, I wanted to set the threshold so that basically only the transient was triggering the compressor. Now I want the compressor basically to be active at all times. Then use a pretty fast attack, medium release, and listen how this is what this is gonna do. I'll bring the threshold down, so basically all the signals getting compressed, somewhere around 3 to 6 dB of gain reduction. What happens is basically the entire signal is just getting compressed by a little bit. However, the really loud parts are getting compressed a little bit more than the really quiet parts. So what this is going to do is I'm going to have to use a little bit of makeup gain to get back to the original signal level. But what this is going to do is basically allow me to bring up the level of the overall signal, and rather than having like a wide dynamic range, I'm going to have a much smaller dynamic range so that the whole piano can basically be sustained and have a much more consistent level throughout my mix. So let me start out with the threshold down, very low ratio. So you think, my threshold is very low here. Basically, all the signal from the piano is going above the threshold. But what I'm doing is just with a really low ratio, what I'm able to do then is squash the entire dynamic range without it being too obvious that I'm using compression. So what can happen if you have a too high a ratio and you just compress the whole signal is that it doesn't sound natural. But by using a really low ratio, it's very subtle, but what you're able to accomplish then is that the level of your piano is much more consistent, especially if you have someone that's been playing and it's a little bit all over the place. Your loud parts are too loud, your quiet parts are too quiet. So let me play this again. You can play around with it. Somewhere between 1.5 and 1.0 is where you want to go for. Not anything more than that, it starts to sound unnatural. So now I'll play it back in my mix and you can hear how it sounds. What I've been able to do now is bring up just basically the entire signal level of the piano, and it's going to then be much more consistent throughout my mix and hopefully fit in better with the other instruments and be able to be controlled easier when I move on to the next stage later on of using like EQ and things like that. So here it is. So this third compression technique where you use a really low ratio and a low threshold is something that I can even combine then with other techniques. So right now I've basically just squashed the dynamic range, but it sounds really natural, and it still sounds unprocessed, like I haven't even really tried to shape the things like emphasizing the transient or the sustain and things like that. So this technique is something that I might use just as the initial processor in my signal chain to just control the level, if that's all you want to do with your compressor to begin with. So depending on what your goal is, you might choose these different techniques. If you want to control the level, if you want to emphasize it or have it process it so it sits better in the mix, either out front or back in the mix. Those are 3 techniques that you can use. I want to move on and show you a different compressor that I like to use. I'm going to go ahead and leave this, maybe back it off a little bit on the threshold. And I'm going to leave this up and show you how you can combine this kind of compression with a very low ratio with the other kinds that I was showing you before. The compressor that I like to use for piano is this SSL comp. It's the G Master bus compressor. It's a model of the SSL bus compressor on their consoles. It's from the model that I'm using is the one from Waves. It has a great preset, the Steve Lillywhite piano setting that they've got here. I'm going to bring that up. And I'll show you how I like to maybe just play around with this, play around with the controls to just, sometimes I like to leave it in the settings it comes up with, but sometimes I might make a few adjustments with the attack and release to make sure that it does the processing that I want. He's using a pretty high ratio here of 10:1, and sometimes that's necessary with the piano to get out the sounds that you're going for. So let me play it back. So because I've got that first compressor, the H comp, still going, back it off a little bit. I don't need to have too dramatic of compression going on here with the 10:1 ratio. Allow the transient maybe to go through a little bit more. So without even getting into any EQ or anything like that, I'm already getting my piano to sit better in my mix just by using compression. I've also shown you how you can even change the tone or the feel of the piano using compression. So you don't always have to be looking to reach for an EQ if you want your piano to cut through more. You can do things like use a compressor. I like the combination I have right now with the H comp and the SSL comp. They kind of complement each other. Next, before I get to EQ, what I want to demonstrate a little bit is this cool plugin that I like from Waves. It's the S1 Imager. It's great if you have piano and you really want the piano to be really wide in your mix and not occupy the center of your mix where you want your vocals to be. Or on the other sense, if you have all your other instruments, like in my mix, I have electric guitar and rhythm guitar panned out pretty wide. You want your piano to be more in the center. You can either use panning controls or you can use this to decrease the width of the sound of your piano. So let me play it back and I'll just give you an opportunity to hear how it sounds, doing the different things, widening and narrowing. And then I'll show you how it basically changes the feel of the piano when there's other instruments involved too. Alright, so I basically want it to be pretty close to the center because I've got my other instruments panned out pretty wide, so I want the piano to be a little bit in the center. You can either do that with these controls as I was doing before, or you can use this plugin. It's mainly used if you want your piano to go wider than possible with the 100 panning settings in your DAW. So let's get to EQ now. This is where you can just do subtle things to brighten up the piano or darken it, depending on your mix. So right now I've got the SSL E channel called up, and I'm even using their preset, the piano one here. And I'll play it back and then activate it, and you can really hear out now the piano is going to jump out in the mix. So with this plugin, the piano has such a wide frequency range. It has really low notes and then also has resonances and much higher notes as well. So you don't have to worry about, EQing frequencies that aren't really existent in your piano that you might for maybe things like guitars or bass or something. You can reach for some of those higher frequencies and use that to basically fill in those frequency ranges in your mix. So the piano really complements some of the other instruments that don't have a lot of higher frequencies, and you can maybe emphasize those more in the piano in your mix, and maybe less like low frequencies. Like here I'm using a high pass filter. I guess it's the low frequencies that's trying to cut those out in case your bass guitar or kick drum is really in those low frequencies. So let me play you back and play around with these in solo so you can hear the frequencies that are being boosted, even up to about 8K. And this is a high shelf that's going right now. So if it was bell, that would be a peaking filter. Now it's a high shelf. So basically everything above 5K up until about 15K is what's being boosted. And that's really where the air of the piano is in your mix. And here around 3K, to me that's a frequency range where it starts to go either bright or dark for a piano. So you can darken it up by pulling out around 3K, or definitely sharpen it, brighten it up if that's what you're going for. Then the body of the piano is around here to 800 to 1000. And I really like how the frequencies were selected for this preset, because basically all you have to do is just reach for the gain knob, depending on what you're hearing. If you're hearing too much bass, just pull out this one, and by being right around 200, that's exactly the frequencies that you can take out. This is where the body of the piano is. This is where basically the bright or darkness of the piano resides. And you're always just going to want to add a little bit of that air up there around 8 to 15K, no matter what. So that's the EQ that I'm using. One thing that sometimes I'll do is I'll have a plugin like the REQ. This one I've just set up, and sometimes I'll use it depending on my vocals that I've got in my track. Right now I don't have any vocals going on, but sometimes I'll have a plugin like this set up. Right now I have it around 500 hertz, and I'm just using a single peaking filter that I'm just using to scoop out the mid-range here, where it would help make space for my vocals to cut through my mix around 500 hertz. So play it back and you can hear the difference. sometimes when I'm mixing, I'll just leave a plugin like this up there where it basically just has one function, and sometimes I'll bypass it and see if that helps. Otherwise, I'll activate it and see if that helps. But it's just something that by just having a single plugin that has one function, like making space for your vocals, you don't have to worry about bypassing the whole thing and how that's going to change. You know, you're going to be, not only are you going to be shaping the top end, but also the low end and all these different things. So if you have space in your plugin inserts to just have a plugin like this where it just serves one function, just bypass it, activate it, and when you're mixing, it's much easier than if you know what each plugin does, just to have it serve one function rather than multiple functions, in order that you can quickly monitor these things and make your decisions about how to balance your overall mix with all these different instruments. The last plugin that I usually throw on piano is the Oxford Inflator. I've got the basically set up to with the main effect right here. You know, not 100%. I've got it in band split mode, so there's 3 bands that's doing the processing. I've turned off the clip mode so I can increase the gain at the input and then back it off at the output, and that's just going to change the overall effect to be much larger. I'm not using the EQ curve here. You can hear what this does. You know, the Oxford Inflator, it's really difficult to describe what it does, but it basically just breathes life into whatever signal goes through it. It makes it come alive and helps it just sit better again in the overall mix. So what I'm going to do is go back through all these plugins, play you back what they're doing, and hear how that, in order, really change and shapes the sound of my piano. So here's a little bit boring, sounding dull and sterile. Fill in the dynamic range first using compressors. So I guess the final point that I want to make is when you're thinking about doing processing on the piano, especially, I found that a lot of times in the past, as soon as I would pull up my piano and try and mix it in with the other instruments, a lot of times I'd be like, oh man, it's not cutting through. I need to reach for an EQ and I really need to brighten it up, and I need to find those frequencies that help it just punch out of my mix. In reality, what I should have been doing and what I recommend is trying to start out with a compressor and see if you can shape the dynamics first so that it cuts through the mix, if that's what you're going for. And then when you add in that EQ, you don't have to worry about just shaping the frequencies so that it cuts through the mix. Rather, you just have to use the frequencies to just subtly change the tone of the instruments with the EQ. So that's how you can use a compressor and EQ together to better accomplish what you're doing without getting too extreme with any of the kinds of processing that you're doing. That's all I've got. Check out my other videos if you want to see other techniques for different instruments, and I'll have more videos as well about how to compare different kinds of piano virtual instruments and different ones that you can select, and hopefully give you a better idea about how different ones sound. And then also other techniques, less conventional techniques rather than just EQ and compression, of what you can do with pianos. So I'll just play it out and let you hear how the piano is sitting in my mix now.